The sun rose over the mountains of eastern Afghanistan like it always did. Quiet, indifferent, ancient. But on July 13th, 2008, in a narrow valley near a village called Wanat, that sunrise would witness one of the most desperate fights of the modern age. A handful of ordinary soldiers, exhausted, underprepared, and surrounded, would stand against an enemy that outnumbered them and knew the land better than any map ever could. Bullets would tear through sandbags, radios would scream and fall silent. Courage would be measured not in victory, but in the refusal to collapse. This is a story about what happens when there is nowhere left to retreat and someone decides to stand anyway. They arrived at Wanat knowing it was dangerous, but not knowing how close death already was. The outpost wasn't even finished, just a shallow, half-built collection of trenches, earth-filled barriers, and exposed fighting positions pressed against a village that watched them in silence. The men of the U.S. Army's 173rd Airborne Brigade and Afghan soldiers beside them had spent days digging into unforgiving ground, sweat mixing with dust, the heat pressing down like a weight on the chest. At night they heard movement in the hills, footsteps, whispers, the metallic click of weapons being handled just out of sight. Everyone felt it, that tightness in the stomach, the sense that the valley itself was holding its breath. Just before dawn, the world exploded. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into the outpost, throwing dirt and shrapnel into the air. Machine gun fire erupted from the slopes above, pouring down from every direction. The enemy wasn't charging blindly. They were coordinated, disciplined. They had studied the outpost's weak points and struck them all at once. Radios crackled as soldiers shouted for support, for air, for anything that could stop the avalanche of fire. Some calls went unanswered, not because help wasn't coming, but because antennae were destroyed, operators were wounded, and time was moving faster than human thought. Inside that chaos were men who had never imagined their final test would come in a place that didn't even exist on most maps. A junior leader crawled across open ground under direct fire to reach a wounded soldier, fully aware that every step might be his last. A medic knelt in the dirt, hands slick with blood, trying to seal wounds while rounds snapped past his helmet like snapping wire. Fear was everywhere, raw, choking. But it did not paralyze them. It sharpened them. Each decision mattered. Stay and fight or move and die. Fire back or be overrun. There was no room for hero fantasies, only survival measured in seconds. As ammunition ran low and positions were lost one by one, something deeper than training took over. These were not legends or mythic warriors. They were sons, brothers, friends, the kind of people who worry about small things in normal life. But in that moment, retreat meant the collapse of everyone else. So they held. They signaled air support with whatever still worked. They dragged the wounded through smoke and dust. They kept firing even when their hands shook from exhaustion and shock. Above them, attack helicopters finally broke through the valley, their rotors beating the air like a giant's heartbeat, pushing the enemy back just far enough. When the firing faded hours later, Wanat was scarred and silent. 8 American soldiers were dead. Many more were wounded. The outpost still stood, not because it was strong, but because the people inside it refused to abandon one another. In the aftermath, there would be investigations, arguments, and debates about planning and command. But none of that erased the truth written into the ground that morning. Ordinary people, facing overwhelming force, chose duty over fear. And in doing so, they revealed something timeless, that courage is not the absence of terror, but the decision to act while carrying it. This battle teaches no easy lesson. It offers no clean victory. Instead, it leaves us with a harder truth, that history is often shaped in half-built places by tired people who never expected to matter this much. And when the moment comes, the measure of humanity is not how loud the world remembers you, but how firmly you stand when everything is trying to push you into the dirt. In the days that followed the battle, the noise of Wanat did not fade. It lingered inside the men who survived. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the phantom sound of incoming fire and the remembered weight of a wounded body being dragged across dirt. Faces of the dead returned without warning, sometimes in the stillness before dawn, sometimes in the middle of routine movements that no longer felt routine at all. Official language would later describe the fight in clean terms: enemy strength, terrain analysis, tactical outcomes. But for those who were there, the truth lived in smaller, harsher details. The smell of burned explosives mixed with sweat. The way hands shook when reloading a weapon that suddenly felt heavier than before. The crushing realization that courage does not guarantee survival, only the chance to protect someone else for a few seconds longer. Among the survivors were soldiers who would never again see leadership the same way. Orders had blurred into instinct during the fight. Rank mattered less than proximity, less than whoever was closest to a functioning weapon or a working radio. One young officer replayed every decision again and again, wondering whether a single different movement might have saved one more life. Another soldier struggled with a quieter guilt. The memory of hesitating for half a second before moving into open fire, a delay invisible to everyone else but unbearable to himself. These inner battles went unseen, but they were as real and relentless as the one fought in the valley. Back home, the world moved on with unsettling speed. News cycles shifted. Headlines shrank the battle into a paragraph, sometimes a statistic. But inside military hospitals and late-night phone calls, the cost remained painfully alive. Families received folded flags and words that could never be enough. Survivors tried to explain what Wanat was like, only to realize that language always fell short. How do you describe the sound of bullets snapping past your ear like cracking ice? How do you explain the moment you realize death is close and choose not to run? Yet even in the weight of loss, something remarkable endured. The men of Wanat did not speak first about enemy numbers or tactical failures. They spoke about each other, about the soldier who kept firing despite shrapnel in his leg, about the medic who refused evacuation until every wounded man was treated, about voices on the radio that stayed calm when panic would have been understandable. These stories were not told to glorify war, but to hold on to meaning, to prove that in the worst conditions imaginable, decency and loyalty had not vanished. The battle forced a reckoning beyond the valley. Training manuals were rewritten. Outpost placement doctrine changed. Hard lessons were paid for in blood, and no one who understood that fact treated it lightly. But beneath policy and procedure lay a deeper truth. Modern battlefields are shaped as much by human resilience as by technology or strategy. When plans break down, and they always do, it is ordinary people, carrying fear and doubt, who decide whether a moment becomes a disaster or a stand. Wanat remains a name few civilians recognize, but its lesson echoes far beyond Afghanistan. It reminds us that history does not always turn on famous generals or sweeping victories. Sometimes it turns on exhausted individuals, isolated and outnumbered, who refuse to abandon one another when survival feels impossible. In that refusal lies a quiet, uncelebrated form of heroism, the kind that does not ask to be remembered, but changes the course of lives forever. Long after the valley was left behind, Wanat continued to fight inside the minds of those who lived through it. Time did not blunt the memories, it sharpened them. The battle returned in flashes, the sudden crack of wood that sounded too much like gunfire, the low thump of a helicopter passing overhead, the way silence could feel dangerous. Some veterans buried themselves in work, in routine, in motion, afraid that stillness would open the door to everything they had tried to seal away. Others spoke openly, trying to drain the poison through words, even when the telling cost them sleep and peace. Survival had not ended the fight. It had only moved it inward. What made the weight heavier was the knowledge that Wanat had not been inevitable. Reports would later confirm what many already suspected. that the outpost was dangerously positioned, that intelligence warnings had gone unrecognized, that resources promised had arrived too late. These findings cut deeper than enemy fire. It is one thing to face death in battle. It is another to wonder whether that battle should have happened at all. Some survivors turned that anger inward, questioning their own judgment. Others carried it outward, wrestling with an institution that struggled to admit failure. None of them walked away untouched. And yet, something unexpected happened in the shadow of that bitterness. The battle began shaping better soldiers, better leaders, not through glory, but through consequence. Those who had held the line at Wanat became voices of hard-earned truth. They warned younger troops about terrain that looks quiet but isn't, about villages that watch more than they speak, about the danger of optimism in places where the enemy has patience on their side. Their lessons were not dramatic. They were precise, practical, written in the language of survival rather than ambition. For some, the transformation went even deeper. A former infantryman, once content to follow orders, felt a relentless pull to understand the systems that had failed them. He studied history, doctrine, engineering, trying to ensure that no one else would be asked to defend an impossible position again. His motivation was not revenge, but responsibility. He carried the names of lost friends like a weight in his chest, a reminder that improvement was not abstract, it was owed. Across the years, others made similar journeys, into teaching, planning, medicine, counseling. Wanat had stripped away illusions, replacing them with purpose shaped by cost. What bound them all was an unspoken understanding of fear's true nature. They knew that bravery is not loud or easy. It is quiet, often lonely, and frequently unrewarded. On that morning in 2008, no one felt invincible. They felt exposed, outmatched, human. But they acted anyway, not because they believed they would win, but because someone beside them needed time, needed cover, needed one more moment to live. That is the kind of courage history rarely notices, but always depends on. The story of Wanat, then, is not confined to a single day of violence. It stretches outward, shaping decisions, saving future lives, and reminding those who listen that progress is often born from tragedy. When systems fail, people adapt. When plans collapse, individuals step forward. And in those moments, the line between disaster and survival is drawn by ordinary humans choosing again and again not to surrender their responsibility to one another. As years passed, the Battle of Wanat moved from immediate memory into something more complex and harder to name. It became a reference point in classrooms, a case study in military journals, a somber discussion topic among officers who spoke in careful, measured tones. Maps of the valley were redrawn with clean lines and analytical symbols, transforming chaos into diagrams. But no chart could ever capture what it felt like to be there. The heat radiating off the ground, the way dust coated the inside of the mouth, the sound of gunfire echoing so sharply that it seemed to come from inside the skull. The danger of hindsight was that it made everything appear understandable. The reality, in the moment, had been anything but. For the men who fought there, the scrutiny cut both ways. On one hand, it mattered deeply that lessons were being learned, that their experience was shaping safer practices, stronger defenses, better decisions. On the other hand, every retelling risked reducing human suffering to professional failure. Some veterans sat in rooms where people debated what went wrong, listening as if the dead were theoretical rather than friends whose laughter they could still hear. They learned to carry that discomfort quietly, aware that the conversation had to happen even if it hurt. Progress, they understood now, often demands reopening wounds. Still, Wanat quietly changed the texture of modern warfare. Remote outposts were reevaluated. Air support protocols were strengthened. Small unit communications redundancy became a priority. Technology adapted. But it adapted because individuals had survived long enough to show where the weaknesses were. No innovation emerged in a vacuum. Each improvement traced back to a moment of panic, a radio that failed, a position that collapsed too quickly. Progress carried fingerprints and names, even when those names were never spoken aloud. Within the veterans themselves, a more personal change had taken root. They carried a sharper awareness of fragility, not just their own, but everyone's. Having seen how quickly control vanishes, they understood leadership as stewardship rather than authority. They knew that confidence without humility can be deadly, and that listening can save lives. Some struggled under this knowledge, others were steadied by it. Either way, Wanat had burned away illusions, leaving behind a hardened, quieter sense of responsibility. There was also pride, careful, restrained, and never shouted. Pride that the line had held when it could have broken completely. Pride that not everyone made it home, but no one had been abandoned. This pride did not erase grief, but it lived beside it, a fragile equilibrium sustained through memory and shared understanding. They did not need monuments to tell them what they had done. The proof was in the fact that others would never face the same conditions again. The battle's legacy, then, was not triumph, but transformation. It showed that modern conflicts are shaped less by grand strategies than by how institutions respond when reality strikes harder than expected. Wanat became a reminder etched into doctrine and conscience alike, that planning must respect the lives it places at risk, and that when it fails, it is human courage, not policy, that absorbs the impact.